Hello and welcome to our Healthy Living series in partnership with Confluence Health. I'm Ash Kuntz and I'm a program manager at NCW Libraries. It's our mission to connect people to vital resources and opportunities that foster individual growth and strengthen communities. And I'm really excited to share this opportunity to learn with you tonight. So tonight is all about sleep with Dr. Ankur Patel. He is a specialist in sleep medicine with a deep passion for all things related to a good night's sleep. He recently transplanted to the area, drawn in first by the natural beauty and lured in more by the people. His journey began on the East Coast and took him to various places to gain invaluable experience, and ended up with him finding a wonderful place to call home in Wenatchee, here, with his wife and daughter. Professionally, he enjoys all manner of sleep topics, but has a unique interest in the circadian rhythms and body rhythms in general, breathing and pattern changes during sleep, unusual behaviors at nighttime, and the development of sleep in all people starting from age of 0. So welcome.
I'm glad you're all here to join us tonight. Ideally, my talk will not put you to sleep, but maybe give you an idea of how we can better our sleep health and how that can maybe help us get a little bit of an insight into our overall wellness. Sleep is kind of a really big part of our health. Obviously, we know we spend roughly about a third of our lives in it, plus or minus, some more so than others. And there's a lot of things that we actually don't know. Sleep to me has been always kind of the final frontier of medicine. We're pretty well aware of most of the body systems and what they do. There's still a lot of little mysteries left to unlock, but by and large, there's a pretty big picture of what's going on. But when it comes to sleep, we're still pretty much scratching our heads. We have a few basic parameters that we understand, and I'll definitely outline those as we go. There's a few things that we're discovering day to day that we really are exploring very quickly, actually. And I think these last few years has been amazing in the field of sleep medicine. And then there's a few things that we carry over from old myths that can sometimes be put to rest based on the new knowledge that we have. And sometimes they actually hold bearing and actually are things to keep in mind. So sleep has been one of those things that we romanticize quite a bit. It's kind of all over in art. It's everywhere we look. And when you really think about it, most of us end up complaining about it more than anything because we're not getting enough of it. So this is actually one of the paintings by Salvador Dali that really starts to get our minds and gears turning a little bit about all the complexities and nuances that we have in. It is just such a bizarre space to be in because it's truly the only time that our subconscious mind can take over. Naturally, during the daytime, it's our conscious mind that's wide awake. And when it's awake, it has a very unique way of thinking. It's all very linear. It's all very sequential. So you can really perceive things as a matter of time and space. Once you enter sleep, all bets are off. In fact, we don't necessarily know most of what goes on during our subconscious mind. There's a lot of processing. There's a lot of things that we do that may come out as bizarre. And for that reason, we're sort of protected from it. The only insight we really get into it is when we dream. And those moments that kind of come off as bizarre or sometimes make perfect sense while we're going through them. And then we go ahead and try to tell the story to someone else. And we think back to ourselves and say, wow, that sounds kind of crazy. That's sort of the closest we're ever going to get to getting a true insight into what happens in the subconscious space. Some of you may recognize Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, and I think we've all had some kind of fascination throughout history with the nighttime and what we do and how we think and what we do as we dream. It's been sort of the fundamental stuffs of psychologists from the beginning of time. And more we're trying to see if there's any real credibility to what we think. At the end of the day, we still don't know. And that's what kind of makes this fun. There's a lot of debate that can happen, but we really don't know what we can do with it. So where do I come in? First and foremost, as a sleep physician, I find that it is my duty to try to make sure we all appreciate sleep. There have been historians, playwrights, all manner of famous folk that we quote from time and time again that have had all sorts of ideas about sleep. We try to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, just because it's poetic in nature and philosophic, but that makes it a lot more fun, a lot more fodder for the thought. So what does a sleep medicine specialist do? Most people think of us as the sleep apnea doctors. We do a little bit more than that. Basically, anything that happens overnight kind of falls into our domain. The big one, of course, is sleep apnea. And as we've come to realize, it's a lot more prevalent in folks than we once thought. The whole idea of snoring being a sign of hard work or a long day has been slowly put to rest. And we started to see that it's actually something important that we need to handle. We talk about insomnia, or the inability or difficulty with falling asleep or staying asleep. Sometimes it's an issue by itself. Sometimes it's an issue that has to do with a circumstance. And sometimes it's tied into some other sleep-related issue. We often talk about being sleepy all day long. Sometimes people have difficulty staying awake, having low energy, fatigue, all manners of difficulty maintaining activities. And that by itself can be a result of a bad overnight, or it could be something that's unique unto itself as well. And finally, I threw this out. I didn't mean to highlight it excessively, but the whole idea of restless leg syndrome and unusual movements and such that occur overnight, that also falls squarely into our domain. A lot of times, depending on the medication being advertised, there's a little bit of push to make a diagnosis sound more realistic. On one hand, restless leg syndrome is a very realistic diagnosis, but it does have very specific criteria. So just because you shake your leg all day long doesn't mean you have it. It's just one of those things that we look for as we're transitioning in and out of sleep. So what is sleep? As of right now, it's sort of our understanding that sleep is a phase of restoration. What's interesting though is sleep is actually a time when our brain is more active, both metabolically and physiologically, than it is during the daytime. You may recall earlier, I mentioned the fact that during our conscious state, the brain really speaks a specific way. It can only perceive thought in a very linear fashion, in sequence, with time and space as restrictions. During the nighttime though, when we're in the subconscious space, it is quite literally chaos. In that chaos, instead of a nice linear thought process that occurs in sequence, what typically happens is that you have one thought that lights up another 1,000 thoughts that light up another 1,000 thoughts, and so on and so forth. And in that chaos, it's all occurring in matters of seconds. Physically, all the neurons that are connected are starting to light up and interact with each other. There's a lot of housekeeping that's occurring. The brain is starting to figure out what's going on, what's relevant, what memories we need to keep, what we need to throw away, what learning pathways are important, what learning pathways need to go away, and what's real and what's not. The problem is during the subconscious mind, we don't really have too much of a frame of reference because our conscious mind has been put to sleep. And we do want to train that, which we'll chat about in a little bit. If any of that's interrupted though, we're not really getting the full depth of sleep that we need to achieve. So as you can see from this first diagram, we talk about these cycles of sleep and stages of sleep. For a time, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding that we go from awake to our shallow sleep into our deep sleep, and we remain there for the rest of the night. What actually happens is that it's all stepwise, and sleep occurs in cycles. The total number of cycles we have is fairly individual. It can be anywhere from 4 to 8. But what we do know is that each cycle is comprised of all of the stages. There's a bit of debate, as you may point out on this slide, between a stage 3 and stage 4. The current status is that stage 3 and stage 4 are effectively the same for all intents and purposes. We can sort of pick it apart as we go. It's a little bit more of an academic thing. But the concept here is that it is a deep sleep stage. Rem sleep is theoretically our deepest stage of sleep from a physiologic point of view. But the reason we typically put it next to wake, as you may notice on that sleep stage diagram, is because if I were to remove certain parameters like movements and eyes, the brain is actually the most active during REM sleep. And when we measure the brain waves, it looks most similar to the wake. So they do talk about dreaming occurring during the REM phase. It sort of begets a philosophical question as to what really is dreaming. The idea that the brain is functioning and creating concepts and ideas is not necessarily unique to the REM phase, nor is it true that you're only in REM phase when you wake up and you remember dreams. But it's a very interesting academic argument that we can't ever really get to the bottom of because we can't quite pick that apart yet. As you can see, we didn't really designate a time on the sleep stage diagram there, and that's on purpose. The normal range of human sleep is 4 to 14 hours. One of the most common questions I get is, what about 7 hours or 8 hours? Is that normal? And my answer to that is always the same. Normal is what your body tells you it needs. In general, your sleep cycle gets set by the time you're in your mid-20s to early 30s. And yes, it does take that long for your body to kind of get itself sorted out for sleep. This tends to coincide with an age where they theoretically say the brain has completed its growth cycles with the neurons inside. It also takes our body's hormones some time to regulate at that point in time. So in theory, once we're in our late 20s and early 30s, that's really when we become who we're going to become, from a sleep point of view, at least. People are naturally wired to be morning or night proclivities. So that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you like to stay up late and wake up late the next day means you're lazy or you've got the wrong physiology. It just might be how you're wired. There's also going to be changes in sleep based on life circumstances. And I alluded to that earlier in the context of insomnia. Sometimes circumstances do dictate what makes our sleep go a certain way. Our bodies do a really amazing job of keeping up. So for example, if you've had a major stressful life event, you might find that your sleep pattern doesn't change as you go through it. But once that event is completed and your body feels as though you're finally taking a break, your brain says, hold on a second, I didn't get a chance to catch up. And so now your sleep cycle may shift. It's perfectly natural for sleep cycles to shift in periods of months at a time, or even years at a time. So for example, if you were an early riser and early to bed for a while, and then several years later, you became a late sleeper and like to sleep in, that's okay. As long as it's not happening on a day-to-day basis, we're not too worried about it. And we can help ourselves in that front as well. The other idea that's important to remember is that sleep cycles occur in a pattern for most folks. So not everybody has 4 cycles, 5 cycles, etc. As I said, 4 to 8 is considered normal. What we know, though, is that each sleep cycle generally lasts between 1.5 hours to 2.5 hours. In theory, each of those sleep cycles gets a little bit more efficient as the night progresses. So your first sleep cycle typically would take the longest. And by the time you're about to wake up in the morning, those last couple of sleeps are supposed to be the deepest and most efficient cycles that go the most quickly, which might last about 1.5 hours or less. What else is important to realize is that because each sleep cycle builds upon itself as you get to the night, continuity is really important. So anything that breaks our sleep really does get in the way of a lot of our restoration and a lot of the function that we do. As I said, we don't know a lot still about some of the functionality that occurs during each of these sleep stages, but what we're starting to realize is that when things go wrong, we can kind of pin it back to a sleep stage cycle or something that occurred during our sleep to mess it up. We also don't know if everybody's sleep cycles are individualized or if there really is a pattern. All we know is that there's a lot of housekeeping that gets done in those deep sleep stages, and it's super important to make sure we coax that in the right direction. So what are some of the effects that sleep has on the rest of the body? This is one of those places we're learning a lot. I apologize for this last picture. I realize it's very busy and I'm not going to go through all these details. I just wanted to point out that really sleep is kind of everywhere. So we know that there's a lot of impact upon the brain, as we've talked about. One of the sort of indirect functions of sleep is actually on the heart and the vascular system. What we've come to realize slowly is the fact that sleep actually gives the heart and the cardiovascular system a chance to do some of the things that it can't do all day long. That's not to say it's going to rest necessarily, but it does actually get put through some of the paces that you wouldn't otherwise get to put it through all day long. It's kind of like a check and balance system or a systems check. The heart and blood vessels, much like every other system in the body, do need to make sure that things are running smoothly, that it's cleaned out, it's done all the stuff it has to do. But especially so because it kind of touches everything in the human body. So when you think about it, if you don't get good sleep, you don't get that engine check. And that can be kind of a problem in the long run. The one thing we know for sure is that sleep deprivation on the whole, for whatever reason, causes a pretty significant increase in heart-related issues. For example, heart valve diseases, heart failure, hypertension or blood pressure, and cholesterol and heart attacks and stroke. What we find is that very specific issues can lead to different changes in the heart. So for example, sleep apnea is the most obvious. When the oxygen patterns change during the nighttime because of issues with breathing, of course, that's going to put a lot of stress on the heart from an oxygen point of view. We also find things like insomnia and sleep deprivation for other causes, irregular sleep rhythms, etc. Put a lot of stress physiologically on the heart and the blood vessels. Our bodies have natural stress hormones that are meant to keep us going in times of extended duress. But if you do that when you don't really have duress, you're putting a lot of stress on the heart unnecessarily. We know, of course, of the brain, and beyond just sleep deprivation and that mental fog that often happens, you can get little issues like being forgetful. A lot of times we don't realize this ourselves. Of course, it's often pointed out to us by a very caring individual, such as a spouse. Like, you forgot your keys, you forgot my name, you forgot my birthday. It can happen kind of often, and it can happen with moods. I don't want to say it's entirely sleep that's making you whatever you are, but sometimes we can chalk it up to that. The other thing that we find that is driving sleep pattern changes and brain-related health changes is actually the diet and exercise component. And I do get a lot of questions about this. Fixing sleep can actually almost always help in the endeavor to maintain and lose weight if needed. When we're constantly sleep deprived or our sleep is not great, our body doesn't get the energy and the restoration it needs. And so it drives you to make dietary choices like looking for high energy foods, such as sweet, carbohydrates, sugars, things that it can burn real quick to get some energy. We find that when we actually are able to improve upon sleep, we're actually able to alter those dietary choices completely subconsciously. We change nothing else except the fact that you get a good night's rest, and suddenly you start eating healthier. One of my favorite analogies to use with most folks is that you have to remember we have 4 basic necessities as humans. We have air, water, food, and sleep. As humans, we need all 4, but in varying degrees. And we only know when we're deprived of certain things, how far we can go. For example, air, you can really only go for a couple of minutes. Water, a couple of days. Food, you can go months. And sleep, a lot of folks go their entire lives without realizing where they went wrong. But the same is true if you were deprived of food for months at a time, and we put an entire platter of food in front of you from all sorts of things, fruits, vegetables, carbohydrates, snacks, sweets. You're not really going to think about what you're putting in your mouth. You're just going to go ahead and grab it and put it in. And unfortunately, the same is true with sleep. If you don't have sleep for quite a long time, your body will go ahead and just try to get you to sleep at any point. And this is where it gets a little bit scary. We think of sleep as a full function, turn your brain off and go to bed at night and wake up in the morning and everything is over. Whereas in fact, it's particularly complicated. As you can see by this big infographic on the bottom here, there's a lot of stuff at play when it comes to sleep. Cognitively though, your brain does need sleep, just the way if you didn't get food for a long time, you're going to try to get it. And so throughout the day, periodically, your brain may choose to shut off sections of your brain and go to sleep. It's sort of hard to perceive, But one of the examples we like to give, and unfortunately one of the most scary, is when we're driving. When you're driving down the road and you're on one of those straight stretches, and the road's nice and easy, and you zone out, that's a very natural phenomenon. When there's things that are redundant and boring, your brain will kind of shut down because it doesn't need to pay attention until something changes. The difference in a person without sleep deprivation or sleep issues versus in someone who does have it is that when the brain comes back online, it's a matter of fractions of seconds that differ. In someone without sleep issues, the brain can come online very quickly if something shows up on the road, and you can make that quick snap decision. In someone who's sleep deprived, your brain will come online just a fraction of a second later or a little bit later, just a touch slower than that. But flying down the highway at 90 miles an hour, that fraction of a second can be the difference between life and death. So we put a pretty big emphasis on it. Naturally, it's not all that morbid. And so there's times where you kind of zone out in the middle of a conversation and you kind of have to ask someone to repeat themselves several times. Could be just because they're boring, or it could be because a part of your brain went to sleep. So I'm hoping nobody asks me to repeat myself just now. Finally, one of the more recent findings that we've had is that sleep does affect the GI tract and the gut biome. And this is a bit of a circular issue because one of the new recent things in the last couple of years is that the GI tract is what they call the second brain. It has a huge amount of innervations. All the bacteria in the gut actually have a really important part to play in generating certain hormones. And one of those hormones, called serotonin, is one of the big ones that helps us cycle with our sleep. On the other side of it, one of the big factors we know that affects the natural gut biome is our sleep cycling. You do need to give your body the ability to rest. And when the body is at rest is typically when the gut gets a little bit more function. So you have to give it the time and the space to do it. And the other side of it is with sleep apnea, unfortunately, because of even the slight changes in oxygen, we found that that actually can significantly alter the bacteria in your gut. And it can actually contribute a lot to inflammatory processes beyond just the gut. For example, the inflammatory bowel syndrome, irritable bowel disease, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, etc. But also other inflammatory diseases like fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic pain that has unknown origin, etc. How do we get to a good sleep? First and foremost, as humans, we kind of have to get out of our own way. While I was training, I had a very passionate attending teach me that one of the worst people for sleep medicine was Thomas Edison with the advent of electricity and light bulbs. Prior to that, we had to deal with candles, which are perfectly fine to a point. But with the ubiquity of light and having light all the time and now concentrated to these little squares that we put in front of our faces right up until the time we go to bed, we've started to force our sleep cycles to shut down. So how do we overcome it? The first thing I tell everyone is that you should try to understand what your sleep cycle looks like. Our sleep cycle starts about 5 or 6 hours before we get sleepy. You may have heard of the melatonin hormone, which is the natural driver of our circadian rhythm. In most folks on a regular 24-hour rhythm for who sleep at about 9 or 10 in the night, that hormone starts to kick off about between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, kind of when the sun is starting to come off its peak and dive down. As melatonin rises, it starts to recruit a whole bunch of pathways and chemicals to get our brain in order. The early part mimics sleep, and so in the order it starts to pull these chemicals in, you can imagine that the first few hours are likely dedicated to bringing on the shallower stages of sleep, making sure you transition properly, etc. And as we get closer to bedtime, that sort of heavy-eyed, warm, fuzzy feeling we get right before we go to bed, that's typically meant for all of the deep sleep stage hormones. Unfortunately, most of us pull up a phone or watch a TV or get some light shining into our face, and there physiologically, we actually start to shut down those pathways. I can't tell you how many times I hear it from most folks. I need the TV to fall asleep. I have to be on my phone. That's the only way I can shut down. There may be some truth to that, but I can promise you for certain that the physical exposure to the blue light wave that is coming out of those devices is shutting off those pathways. And we can be none the wiser because as humans, all we know is whether we're asleep or we're awake. Everything else in between is an inference. I sleep shallow, I sleep deep, I hit my REM. Those are all excellent assumptions. But we can't prove any of that until we actually get you in a sleep lab and diagnose it. The best thing we can do for ourselves is take some cues from our physiology to kind of ride the wave of our natural circadian drive. We have to eliminate chemicals. And by chemicals, I don't necessarily mean any external concepts, but the very basics like coffee, tea, caffeine-based beverages, alcohol, or what I call over-the-counter depressants, eating too close to bedtime. And again, this ties into the gut health situation. Stimulating TV. This one's a little bit of a soft one, and this one's sort of because everybody's got their own version of it. I've got some wonderful examples to give you on that front as well. But suffice to say, it's not so much the content of what you watch, it's really just the light coming at you. Exercise before bed is sort of out in the jury at this point in time, and we're not entirely certain. We don't want to limit anybody from doing exercise. We'd certainly be hard pressed to say don't exercise if that's the only time you can do it. You do really need to measure it subjectively though. Some folks respond really well to exercise shortly before bed and gets them nice and tired and relaxed and puts them down. Some people get extremely energized. It depends on their own physiology and their own workout. So take that for what it's worth, but do what works for you. Some of the things that can help with getting to sleep better are kind of keeping moving a little bit before you go to bed. And it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it doesn't have to be anything strenuous necessarily. Sometimes just that amount of motion and sudden change from going walking days, standing, even just shuffling around in the kitchen, and then stopping and going to bed makes a distinct change for the body to understand. The temperature ideal, and sorry, I know it's in Celsius and we tend not to use that unit here, but more or less you want to think in that sort of 60 to 70 range is actually optimal for sleep. Reading is good. There's a lot of theories behind how reading helps beyond just actually concentrating on the page, but the movements of the eyes can mimic what happens during your REM sleep cycle. Aerating the room, of course, adding good clean air and oxygen is always a good thing. Dust is never a good idea no matter what you have, but with sleep, we want to take it a little bit more seriously. You want to talk about the regimen of time of day. So what they talk about is specifically doing things at the same time every evening. And again, this is not a rigid thing. It does not mean that at 10 o'clock every night you must decide to go to bed, but your body starts to cycle and you start to feel it around the same time of day when it's time to put a routine together and go to bed. They talk about meditation. Incidentally, meditation immediately prior to sleep is not necessarily the best advice, but it's great to do during the day because it puts you in a state of relaxation and puts you a little bit more mindful about what to do next. I know it seems a little bit elementary, but I went ahead and picked up a toddler's version of a bedtime routine because it just made sense. And if it works for them, we shouldn't forget it. Simple things are required of us when we go to bed, but they should be done in the same order, the same way every single night. You don't need more than 3 or 4 activities, but it has to be consistent. So what does an optimal sleep routine look like? At whatever time of night you decide it's time to go to sleep, the first and most important thing is to shut down the lights. Try to stay in lights that are extremely low. Think candles as the concept. You want a dim, low light in the red, orange, warm temperature spectrum. Pretty much when you decide it's time to go to bed, that should be the maximal amount of light you get. Darkness is obviously ideal. If you've watched TV up until that point or been on your phone up until that point, that's fine. But try to give yourself a good 30 minutes to make sure that you wash out the physical light stimulation from all of the devices that you've been exposed to all day long. In that 30-minute process, as soon as you start, go ahead and go through some movements and things that get you down. So that's where this checklist comes in handy. whatever basic things you do prior to going to bed, like brushing your teeth or washing your face or changing your pajamas, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to make it unique to your sleep. So every night it should look identical. If I were to see what you do on any night of the week before you go to bed, I should not be able to tell what day of the week it is. Now, again, I'll emphasize the same point. It does not matter what time you do that, as long as when you decide it's time to go to bed, you partake in exactly the same activities. One of the little tricks I offer most folks that come to see me is that when you finish that process, which likely won't take you more than 5 to 10 minutes if you're really, really taking your time, put a chair next to your bedside and sit in the chair. In our fast-paced world with a lot of stress, and we need a space in which we need to unwind, but it cannot be in your bed. That's where the chair comes in handy. As you finish up your process, go ahead and settle into the chair. The chair doesn't have to be uncomfortable, but it should be right next to the bed. And that's where you kind of get your brain to turn down. Our brains kind of get in our own way because we have a lot going on and we want to think about things and answer a lot of questions. But the brain is designed to sleep. So when you sit in the chair, try to do something calm and relaxing. Again, do not look at your phone. Do not turn on a screen. Don't have any light exposure. Reading books is fine as long as you can do so by dim, low light. It should be a proper paper book though, not on a screen. So no tablets, ideally not really e-readers, but if you really have to, it should be one of those that doesn't have a good backlight. And if you're not into reading, sound is actually really helpful. Sound is actually pretty subjective. So you can listen to really anything you want, as long as it makes you calm and puts you in a positive space. I often recommend something with a voice, such as an audiobook or a podcast or a talk show or comedy or radio. Our brains can really only focus on one voice at a time. So if you're listening to somebody else talk, chances are you'll ignore yourself or vice versa. And when you start to ignore yourself or another voice, your brain does start to categorically shut things down. That's pretty much the trend into sleep. I did mention earlier about meditation not being something you want to do right before bed. And part of the theory behind that is that meditation, as relaxing as it may be, is cognitively really no different than what you think all day long. The thought processes that you have include motivation, initiating a thought, executing an action, and assessing it and starting over. One of the ideas is to have a voice in the background that can guide you through what you want to do to get to bed. It helps you really shut down a little bit better, but it also helps you remain passive. The key here is you do want to be passive because any level of activity can turn the brain on. Now, all that being said, sometimes it's really good to just watch the inner monologue and see what's going on inside your own brain. Especially if you've had one of those days where you're carrying a lot of extra stuff with you, or it's been really stressful or anything like that. Letting your brain kind of play it all out is actually not a bad way to go. You may not solve the world's problems sitting in your chair, but your brain reaches natural junctures in the thought process where it can say safely, I'm done thinking about this and I can hang this up until tomorrow, or no, I need a little bit more time and I can run in with this and finish it out. You may not get the subjective satisfaction of solving a problem, but your brain is going to be more happy before you put it to rest. Another thought, and a lot of things that people tell me, is that I feel like my brain's running 1,000 miles an hour. The truth of it is, it might be, but it's not really taking a lot of time. And herein lies the beauty of the difference between the conscious and subconscious mind as you go to sleep. As you sit there in your chair thinking, and you feel as though you're thinking out all of the world's problems in a short amount of time, and then you feel like, oh man, I must have been awake for hours. You look over at the clock and maybe a few minutes have gone by. That's a good sign. That means your brain has to go into the subconscious and light up all of those neurons and all those thoughts, and then your conscious mind was trying to make sense of it. But the only way it knows how is in line, in sequence, and so it felt like a long time, but not really. A lot of time has passed. That means you're starting to tip into sleep, and that's a really good thing. So let your brain run. Sometimes that movie is the best one. The cue to leave the chair is when your eyes get heavy and you get that nice warm fuzzy feeling, and you know that when your head hits the pillow, you're going to drift off to sleep and head off to the races. That's it. That's really all you want to do in the bed. If your eyes are open and your brain is running, you should not be in your bed. You can sit in your chair. There's some advice out there about getting up and being productive, and I tend to disagree with that. We don't want the brain to get into a habit of getting up and being productive when it's supposed to be sleeping. So in your designated sleep hours, as painful as it can be, you should be grounded to your room. Stay in your chair if you're awake, but you're not allowed to leave that space. Over time, your brain will fall in. It starts to pick up on the fact that you're really not allowed to do anything else. So I might as well sleep. You may have also heard that old trick. If you forget something, they tell you to walk out of the room and walk back into the doorway and you'll remember it. And there is some truth to that. The brain compartmentalizes information based on space. When you cross a threshold, the brain thinks you're changing spaces. As humans, we've created this habit. When you wake up and get started for your day, you leave your bedroom. So naturally, a portion of your brain is going to wake up as soon as you walk out the door. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work the same way coming back in. The brain wakes up a lot more easily than it falls asleep. Physically, it may not feel that way most mornings, but that's the truth. So why does this matter? Because it sounds like we're talking about falling asleep. The truth is you can't fix your sleep while you're asleep. So the last set of instructions that you give your brain before you go to bed is absolutely critical. It needs that foundation so it doesn't have to wake you up in the middle of the night to figure out how to go back down. By using external cues like isolating your bed space for the purpose of sleep alone, you can start to minimize the amount of times your brain wakes up to figure out what to do next. If you train the brain to go to bed properly throughout the night and you take your time with it rather than rushing in and collapsing just because you're tired, all the switches that need to be turned on and off in the right order, in the right direction, the hard work that melatonin started several hours before won't be turned off by a few little changes that you make at night before you go to bed. It'll allow that ballet to take place, and it is very much worthwhile. So, when do we start to get concerned? After all of this, if you feel like I've tried all that, I feel great, except for I don't know why I can't sleep. Here's some things to talk to your primary care about. If you've had issues with your changing sleep patterns and you don't know why, so for example, not because of shift work changes or anything like that, but you just can't figure out why all of a sudden you just really need to sleep a lot longer, or you just can't sleep. You got 2 hours of sleep and that's all you get. Maybe ask your primary about what's going on. If your sleep keeps breaking through the middle of the night, you keep waking up in a panic or having unusual dreams very regularly, you start doing things at night, like getting up and walking or eating or talking or driving. Sounds absurd, but I've actually had that happen. You might want to talk to your primary about some of that stuff. In the daytime, you want to keep an eye out for low energy, fatigue, being sleepy all the time, almost having trouble staying awake in certain situations that most people don't. If it strikes you as odd, maybe it's something worth running by your primary. This one sort of ties into a big issue that we've been starting to realize more lately, but it's a liability for work. If you're having problems because you're just clumsy or you feel like you're not performing well and it's all because of sleepiness, that's definitely something worth talking about. We're digging into this more and more now. especially throughout the last couple of years, as obviously a lot of folks have had to take on more workload than before. It seems like sleep has been getting sacrificed in favor of trying to get bodies into work or get staffing accommodated, et cetera. And it's a bit tough. I think we've been starting to see a rise in workplace-related accidents just because people are sleepy, or deterioration in performance, both cognitively and physically, in the context of poor quality sleep. Sometimes it just has to do with the fact that you need a few extra hours of sleep, and sometimes it can point to something else that's going on during the middle of the night. Naturally, one of the things that I get a lot of is a couple that walks in my door, and one partner says, "I have nothing wrong with my sleep," and the other one says, "Oh, yes, you do." And the first question I ask is, well, who is it that I need to deal with first? 9 times out of 10, the person who doesn't know what's going on in their sleep is not incorrect, or they're not being stubborn. It's just that they don't know because they're asleep. So some of us are very fortunate to have a partner looking out for us overnight. So we should take it seriously. So don't fuss if they tell you to see the sleep doctor. Finally, we have some physiologic things that are tied to sleep. And again, this has to do a little bit with what I pointed out before, where sleep is kind of intrinsic in a lot of different issues. The big ones, of course, are cardiac. So we get a lot of folks referred from cardiology for issues with managing blood pressure, changes in their heart rhythms, such as arrhythmias and atrial fibrillation. We get some referrals from the lung doctors because there can be issues with the lungs that we just can't quite figure out. Headaches in the morning, not able to breathe, the sensations of choking oddly during the day, or people just sitting and pausing breathing and can't figure out how that came to be. We're starting to see the metabolic connection. Folks that are otherwise in pretty good health start to have difficulty with managing blood sugar, or hormonal changes like thyroid issues. Of course, the apparent ones are things like worsening memory and cognitive ability. So if you seem forgetful, out of the ordinary, or you can't remember somebody's name or birthday, can't remember where you put your keys, simple things, sometimes it might be worth exploring that a little bit more. And of course, if it's not something specific that I've addressed here, but it really just doesn't fit and you can't come up with a good organic cause, it might not hurt to give us a shout.
This is the time we can trickle in questions. And one of the ones that we've got a question around, I think, biological sex and how that affects sleep.
Sure. That's a really complicated one and actually kind of goes both ways. So it's, of course, physical activity with a release of pretty positive hormones, ideally. It can actually help with sleeping just because of the way the hormones tend to subside after. It's kind of one of those things that actually is pretty well implicated in performance issues overall. So for example, we find folks with decreased libido or inability to perform over time when there's sleep deprivation. One of the things that actually happens, and this is sort of an unusual circular issue, is ever since they've started showing those advertisements on TV for men with low testosterone, we've seen an uptick because actually sometimes that low testosterone can be a sign of sleep apnea, not the other way around. So I don't know if that quite answers that question. It seemed a little ambiguous, but I hope I did.
We had another one that was, what is your opinion on naps?
That's actually a really good question too. So, it's funny, I had somebody ask me about this earlier today, and they cited Dr. Oz and some of these TV docs that talk about take a nap at lunchtime and it's good. The truth of it is I got feelings about that, but we'll talk about that another time, I suppose. I think when we talk about naps as a sleep professional, a true nap is 15 to 20 minutes. And that's where it gets kind of tricky because most times you can't, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. My bias is that I can't really do that. And I don't know very many people that truly can get a 15 to 20 minute nap and they get refreshed. I hear stories about it all the time. But whether or not you can pull it off, I don't know. The reason we use that time designation is because once you cross that limit, you start to go into your sleep cycles. And in the middle of the day, if you kind of clock out and your sleep cycle starts, and then you stop it, or it stops naturally after a certain point in time, it does create the habit. Your brain does stop it, and then it happens during the middle of the night, and you can't really do much about it. So on the whole, my blanket statement is don't nap. But the caveat is if you can pull off the 15 to 20-minute power nap, have at it.
So then there is another question about as people age or get a little older, they're waking up a few times a night to go to the bathroom. Is that a fairly normal thing?
Yeah, that's another great question, actually. And so it's normal in the sense of we see it when we see some changes in our sleep pattern. And this actually is a little bit of a long answer, so bear with me as I go through it. But the concept here is that if you're sleeping deeply enough, you ignore your bladder. What a lot of folks realize, and this may be, I don't know if this is necessarily true in the case of whoever is asking the question here, but if you wake up periodically to go, sometimes your void is of small volume. Whereas if you were to hold it all night long and then you go in the morning, the void is much larger. And that doesn't have to do with anything that's wrong with your bladder or your sensation. It's just the fact that you may not be sleeping so deeply. And so your brain senses the stimulus and makes you wake up to go. It starts to become a bit of a circular issue when sometimes it's sort of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did you get the sensation to go and then go to the bathroom? Or did you wake up and realize, all right, well, there's something I can take care of. So you went to the bathroom. And when that pattern persists, unfortunately, our brains get really good at making bad habits. And so we kind of let it persist a little bit longer, but it can be a sign of something else going on throughout the night that we need to address by causing you to sleep a little bit deeper.
Gotcha. So that's probably one of those things that if it's a big persistent thing, definitely speak to your PCP.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We had another question about how long do you let sleep problems go on before you start seeking like prescription medication, or are there other steps that you can take before that stage?
That's a really good question as well. So this has to do a lot more with what is going on with you personally. A lot of people they feel differently when their sleep has changed. A lot of times we kind of come back to it as sort of the last resort answer. And that was one of the things I was pointing out a little bit about. We get referrals out from cardiology or pulmonology because they're sort of digging and they can't find a good answer. They say, why not check out sleep? It never hurts to ask right away. When it comes to specific medications, though, as a professional, I tend to say, wait until we can diagnose it a little bit more in detail. A lot of the things I outlined here are what's part of good sleep therapy. And we've actually found scientifically, we actually have the data to back it up, that this is really the only way that you can address all stages of sleep safely. Most medications that are prescription actually only address certain stages of sleep. So if I give you something over the counter, or if I give you a prescription without knowing exactly where the issue lies, it can actually be to your detriment. Sorry, I know that doesn't necessarily ask the question about when to ask, but at any point, if you feel like you're having trouble with sleep, at least have a discussion about getting an evaluation and then let somebody decide what is best for you.
Can other major life changes like retirement cause changes in your sleep pattern or your ability to fall asleep?
Yes, absolutely. And this is another great question. This is something I hear a lot about as well. That's a really big change in life, retiring. For some, it's very positive. For some, it's very negative. Almost always it's accompanied by a little bit of anxiety and varying degrees of excitement. Especially folks who either were retiring early by unnecessary cause through the course of the pandemic, or decided some life change made them do so. We see a significant change in their sleep patterns. What's interesting is how it goes. So a lot of times your outlook and your ability to kind of maintain your day-to-day is what governs how well you'll navigate that retirement. So for example, if you've been working very specific hours your entire life and that's been kind of a second home to you, changing that situation will most certainly affect your sleep. a lot of times in the beginning, it's a little bit of a negative effect because you still maintain some of those things like the habits that you brought with you or that need to validate your day by going to work or having something to address all day long. And when it gets taken away, you almost have to be a bit creative in a way to make that happen. We've seen it go the other way where folks actually jam-pack their schedules and actually are extremely excited about it and have a much better and smoother transition through retirement. They're tired because they're just overdoing it a little bit. And that's also a fair point. But yes, we do see major life changes causing changes in sleep.
Well, it is getting close to the end of our hour. So I wanted to just say thank you so much again for your time tonight and the information you've shared here. Hopefully we'll all sleep really well tonight. But join us next Wednesday, May 18th at 7 p.m. for the next presentation in our series, Don't Take My Breath Away, Preventions and Screening for Lung Cancer with Dr. Saba Lodi. You can learn about all of our events on our website at ncwlibraries.org or by following us on Facebook.